I want to talk to you today about podcasts. I've been a Christian now for 10 years, and since I've been a Christian, I've listened to a lot of, even before I got into podcasts, I listened to a lot of sermons and stuff online from my phone in my car. I spend a lot of time in my car, really not so much in the past 6 months, but for years I would spend hours a day in my car driving from place to place. If it's with work or picking up kids from school or just running errands, I'm always on the road. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. Early on in my Christian walk, I listened to sermons. I would listen to 3 or 4 sermons a day. I would listen to a lot. I listened to a lot of Mark Driscoll. I listened to Piper and a lot of Reformed guys, although I'm not Reformed myself. But I listened to a lot of Reformed guys, mainly because they had really good sermons and really good content. Since I've become a pastor in the past 6 months, I don't really listen to that much preaching at all. I'll listen to some occasionally, but I really stay away from it because as a new pastor, I don't want to copy mannerisms or the way other people, or styles of the way other people teach. I really want to find my own, have my own voice, use my own voice. Don't want to copy any mannerisms or subconsciously copy anything from any other sermons that I've heard. So I've really stayed away from listening to any kind of real sermons since I've been a senior pastor here at First Baptist Sibley. But one thing that I have listened to in the past few years, and I still listen to every day, just about every single day, is I listen to a lot of Christian podcasts. I listen to a lot of Christian podcasts because in the car, I don't really listen to a lot of music unless I have one of my daughters in the car, and my oldest always is wanting to listen to music. But my youngest one, she's 10, and she loves listening to a lot of these podcasts with me. So let me just talk to you a few minutes, give you some ideas of some Christian podcasts out there that maybe you're not familiar with, or maybe you've been interested in Christian podcasts and trying to find some to check out. I'll go through a list of my favorite ones here for you, and I'm going to start my list a little bit differently. I was going to start with my favorite first, but I'll leave my favorite one for the very, very end. Some of the Christian podcasts, now I want to put this disclaimer out there. Now, a lot of these podcasts, in fact, most of them, are from a Reformed perspective. I am not Reformed. Perhaps I have some Reformed leanings. There's some parts of the tulip that I agree with, but I am not a five-pointer. I am not a Calvinist whatsoever. Now, this isn't a video to debate Calvinism or to. I got Calvinist brothers and sisters out there. That's fine. That's great. Not a problem with me. So I would just want you to hear that all these podcasts I'm talking about, I do not necessarily agree with their theological standpoints. I don't necessarily agree with everything they say at all. Some of it is for entertainment value. Some of it is to help in church leadership. And I take away the meat and spit out the bones, so they say. The first one I want to mention to you, if you're in ministry at all, is the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast. The Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast. That's a really good podcast because he does a lot of interviews. He does a lot of interviews with church leaders, and they're long. So if you're on a long road trip, Carey Nieuwhof is a good one to get into if you want to listen to some church leadership talk. The problem I find with some of Carey Nieuwhof's stuff is that some of the leadership he has on there really look at church from a business point of view. And some of that I don't necessarily like, but there are some leaders he has on that I'll see that he has on and I'll listen to them, and they're very nice. They're very helpful. Another good ministry podcast to listen to as far as to help preach and teach is one that I just recently discovered called Preaching and Preachers. Preaching and Preachers. That's a really good one. It's very self-explanatory. They're about 30 minutes long, and it's and I forget the names of the people that do this podcast, but a guy talks about preaching, different aspects, about openings of sermons. There's one of how to preach through the book of Acts. There's another one on Adrian Rogers and his preaching style. So I find that to be really interesting to get different perspectives on preaching. And because I'm a preacher and I preach, I thought that was a really cool podcast, and I find it to be helpful in places. Another one is Rainer on Leadership. Thom Rainer is the president of Lifeway. He has two podcasts that I like. It's Rainer on Leadership, and those are pretty short. I think they're like 20 minutes a piece, and they're just all kinds of different perspectives from church leadership. I mean, everything from how do you do Facebook posts for your church, or how do you increase attendance, all these, just all these different perspectives that he has. And he does interviews as well. And Thom Rainer has been in the game forever, so he has some really, really good advice. He also has another podcast called Revitalize and Replant that I listen to. I'm at a smaller church, and this church that I'm at now is more of a church replant when I walked into it. So I've recently got into Revitalize and Replant because I figured he may have some good practical advice for me there. There's another podcast called The Briefing that's really interesting. It's really like a daily news. If you don't read the newspaper, if you don't watch the news channel, which I don't do either one of those, The Briefing is kind of cool. Dr. Al Mohler kind of goes through articles of the day, and this is a daily podcast. I think it's Monday through Friday, so it's 5 days a week. He kind of looks at headlines for the day, and he looks at them from a biblical perspective. And I think that podcast also is about 25 to 30 minutes long. So it's a really cool podcast. Some of the articles are really neat, and he has a very interesting take on those articles with a biblical perspective. So I really like The Briefing. I listen to that on occasion. Now, some of the podcasts that I listen to the most, that I really love, that is really almost more entertaining than anything else. One is Not Another Baptist Podcast. It's Kyle and Matt. These are a couple of pastors in New Mexico, and they talk about church. I think they talk about church planning and stuff like that too, but they're really funny. They work really well together. They have a good chemistry together. They will interview other pastors occasionally as well. But they are a really, really good podcast to listen to. Now, I'm a Southern Baptist, so this is kind of within my wheelhouse of things that I can relate to and things they poke fun of that I think is funny also. Another podcast is the Bar Podcast, B-A-R, the Bar Podcast. And I forget his name too. I didn't write it down. I forget his name too. But he's really interesting, really funny guy. His podcasts are a little bit longer. I don't watch him as much or listen to him as much as some of the other ones. One I found recently that I love is hysterical is These Go to 11. That's a Spinal Tap reference, the movie Spinal Tap. Everybody I talk to, I make a joke about These Go to 11. Nobody gets it. Nobody has seen Spinal Tap that I know. It's really frustrating. But these guys obviously have seen the movie, and they named their podcast These Go to 11. It's Nathan, I don't know his last name, and Zach Bartels. Zach Bartels is on another podcast that I listen to called The Gut Check. The Gut Check, and the Gut Check podcast is a lot like These Go to 11. It's Zach Bartels and this guy named Ted Cluck. And they're really good buddies, and they just talk about just a bunch of random stuff. They're authors, so they often read from a book that they co-wrote together. They'll read chapters out of that book, and they just do really stupid stuff. Like they did an episode on eating tacos. They ate tacos on the podcast. It was funny. Some people loved it. I fast forward through a lot of that one, but they're funny guys. The Gut Check podcast. Now, moving into my very top favorite ones is the Reformed Pubcast. The Reformed Pubcast. That's Les and Tanner. Now, these podcasts, they aren't as consistent now. They used to make them nearly every week. They're not as consistent with making their podcasts anymore, but there's a ton of them. If you have not listened to them, I would recommend going and listen to these guys. They are definitely Reformed guys, and they have pretty strong opinions on their beliefs, and so it's really interesting to listen to. They take a lot of comments from people that will call in, and they'll respond to those comments. So it's really cool. It's really interesting. These guys, it's called the Pubcast because these guys drink beer, and they will review a beer on there. I mean, they're not getting drunk. I'm assuming they probably have about one beer when they do the show, and they'll comment on the beer that they're drinking and what they like about it, and I think that's kind of interesting. The top two favorite. the Happy Rant podcast. This is Barnabas Piper, Ted Kluck, and Ronnie Martin. It is just funny stuff. They have random topics, and they do just that. They rant about various things. They also have started doing a sports edition. If you're into sports, I'm not. But if you're into sports, they have a sports edition that they do now where they rant about a bunch of things in sports. So that may be one you check out. The Happy Rant podcast, absolutely hilarious. All-time favorite, number one, is Doctrine and Devotion. I absolutely love Doctrine and Devotion. Jimmy Fowler and Joe Thorne. Joe Thorne is the senior pastor at Redeemer Fellowship in St. Charles, Illinois. And he has an elder that's now an elder. He was an elder candidate forever on the show, but he's now an elder at the church, and he's bivocational. He has a job also. But Jimmy Fowler is his name, and these guys are really funny and educational. They have Doctrine and Devotion, so you can imagine that they really dive into theology. They dive into doctrine. They speak primarily about those things, but they talk about it from a Reformed Baptist perspective, like two friends that have known each other for a long time would. They cut up with each other a lot. There's a lot of banter, so if you don't like banter, it may not be the show for you, but there's a lot of banter back and forth. Very funny guys. They have a lot of really, really interesting insights. They talk about what really caught me with Doctrine and Devotion in the beginning was they started out talking about all the bad things in ministry. So they talked about tattoos, cigar smoking, and drinking, I think. And it's early on in the podcast. They spoke about all those things because they have tattoos, they smoke cigars, and they occasionally drink. So they talked about all those things, and I thought that was really interesting. Listen to that. But they come out with 2 podcasts every week, which I really like because I listen to podcasts daily. So my recommendations, those are all my recommendations. I recommend listening to those. And if you are looking at, I have an Android device, and if you're trying to find an app to play podcast on, I recommend the 2 I use. The first one is Stitcher. I use Stitcher all the time. If you download Stitcher on your phone from the App Store, you can then search any podcast you want. Most every one of these podcasts that I've listed here, you can get on Stitcher. There's like 1 or 2 that you can't, and that's why I downloaded another podcast app called Podcast Addict. Podcast Addict has a few on there that I can't get with Stitcher. Anyway, guys, thanks for listening to me ramble about podcasts. I hope that some of these podcasts are helpful or funny, or that you will download and listen and support these guys because they put out some really, really good content. As always, guys, if you like this video and want to see more, please subscribe, like, comment, leave some comments down below. Let me know of some of your favorite podcasts that you like, that you love, and you listen to, because I'm always in the market for new podcasts. So please put some comments down below. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions. Well, hope you guys have a great day. God bless. Take care.